Well, hi everyone. Good morning. It is still the first talk of the day, so I understand if some of you are tired, but there's plenty of coffee. Hopefully this will be the first of many entertaining presentations, probably one with a little bit less of the technical expertise. So what I'm charged with doing is really opening up the conference in many ways and starting to get us to think about how there are different barriers behind the integration of deep learning in healthcare. I, as Amir mentioned, come to you all from the UK Science and Innovation Network. So we're a group of about 100 different people employed by, there's a gap in the floor, employed by the British government. So through the Foreign Office, which is the equivalent of the State Department, and then the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. So it's a joint network in many ways. I do have an American accent. I am from Texas, and I do live in Boston, but I promise I'm not a spy. All of that to be said, I will go ahead and jump to the slide deck. If you guys have any questions, it's kind of hard to see actually with the lights. So if you don't mind just holding them till the end so I can see, that's great. So in order to kind of unpack this question, I'll start by giving an overview of where we currently are, then give a quick briefing on where we're going, and then discuss in a little bit more detail what some of those barriers are and why we're not where we thought we would be not so long ago. So I recently produced a report on the future of machine learning in healthcare for the British government. To start that out, I looked into the different relationships and the different challenges that we're going to face in the near future or that are preventing us from moving forward. We're able to break that down into three distinct areas that each have their own set of relationships to unpack: cost, care, and innovation. Within a lot of those, there are quite a few trends, as you can see, that fall underneath these, and that are really some of the things that we're going to start to look at and start to unpack as we're looking at the integration of machine learning in healthcare or deep learning in healthcare. Currently, there are about 10 innovations that are starting to transform the market as we now see them. A lot of these are actually going to be discussed throughout the summit, so I think that's pretty exciting. But most of these, if we actually think about it, fit in the traditional care model. One of the challenges within that, and the basic challenges of deep learning, is that you need a feedback loop. But in traditional care, we lack a lot of that. So we're moving from the patient being sick to the patient being happy, and somewhere between 7 to 12 minutes of your doctor's visit, whether that be your first ever visit with that physician or a routine visit, they have to look at all of your patient files, possibly look at any genomic data that you have, then compare that to the phenotypic data, the current presentation of how you're sick, try to ask you about your nutrition and your health that you self-report. I'm pretty sure we all say that we go to the gym more than we actually do. And then we hope that that patient is happy and healthy after that visit or becomes that way. And the only way that we know is if they return to us sick again. So there's a big gap right there and right there alone, and that's when we're looking at transformative medicine and that joining of deep learning in healthcare, that we don't have a feedback loop. And in order for us to actually realize the benefits of deep learning, we have to start thinking about an integrated care model. Not as easy as one would think. But if we have increased access all around to the patient files, if we have these feedback loops that we're able to start to add into the medical system and look at transforming rather than disrupting the current medical system, we really can work in the traditional model, but just start to make sure that deep learning can fall into that. So what is actually in our way? And why are there only 10 real transformative innovations that are coming onto this market? A lot of that comes back to the business perspective. So machine learning in healthcare or deep learning in healthcare is high risk, high uncertainty for a lot of the reasons on the right. So government hospital policies, compensation models aren't up to speed. We have issues with e-health records, the interoperability, the validation models of how you actually look at algorithms. I think the FDA just at the beginning of this month started to publish a white paper that suggested how they might validate any sort of artificial intelligence that goes to market, not even deep learning models. So a lot of uncertainty in many ways. The challenge on top of that is that traditional healthcare is already low risk and low uncertainty. So trying to disrupt that model and actually shifting us to be able to leverage the ecosystem or build an ecosystem and leverage that future marketplace is going to be really challenging unless we engage the right people. So another great diagram that shows us how difficult this could be to unpack. So the traditional, let's see, pointer. The traditional network and what we would work within would be, nope. Not today. Okay. Would be within that big circle of the provider network. I know hospitals is just a generalization. I'm sure many of you would say that it's a networked provider network as well. That's fine. I agree with you. But for simplification purposes, we tried to keep the bubbles down. So you could look at the traditional model of how you get into a hospital system or into the care network of you can go through your care team, your physicians, PAs, nurses, your specialized care units. That's some of what you see with the ophthalmology or radiology. You could go to the innovation and procurement teams, maybe if you have new surgical or robotic procedure equipment. Or you could go through e-health records, looking at scheduling, billing, and processing, or even going through clinical trials, research and development, and that staff. But that's kind of a closed box. You could call it a Pandora's box, you could call it Schrodinger's. Either way, we gotta open it up. Because if we're gonna open it up and leverage this opportunity, we need to start talking and communicating both outside of that circle and inside of that circle to the regulators and to the funders so that we can really start to leverage this opportunity. But there are a lot of challenges with that. And I'll tell you how the British government and how we're starting to manage that. So from our foresight report, we looked at a couple of different areas that we really need to start to address moving forward and to start to, again, migrate from high risk, high uncertainty to low risk, low uncertainty. Some of what my team is doing with the UK Science and Innovation Network, and again, we look at 5 to 50 years out. So we're looking to build stronger research communities in the areas that need more diagnostic support. So one of the easiest examples is looking at maternal health. About 80% of the preterm births that do happen are completely unpredicted ahead of time. So that means that 80% of women who go into preterm labor, who knows where they are when that happens, rather than them being on bed rest or having some sort of preventative mechanisms. So we're looking at how do we start to look at those areas where physicians and patients both care about unpacking that a little bit more and want to share data, are incentivized to share data, and where we can show really simple returns for starting to integrate machine learning. The other question that always comes up, ethics of AI in healthcare. So we've done quite a bit of work on with the Center for Data Ethics based in the UK, with Health Data Research UK and the NHS to start to unpack that question of how do we share data, how do we do that within GDPR, and what about if we want to share with the US, how do we look at HIPAA and then also GDPR and how do those map together? On top of that, what are the liability structures and what if a cybersecurity event happens, and what is consent within all of that. And the last thing we're really looking at, and I will invite you to chat with me if you have interest in any of these, because I would love to work with you all, is innovation ecosystem. So we are also looking at the fact that as we open up the data that the NHS has, and as different hospitals in the US open up the data that they have and we're able to unlock that, how do you actually share data? How do you share intellectual property to make sure that we're building that ecosystem from the bottom up while simultaneously not discouraging people from jumping into that system? Because at the end of the day, anyone who houses the data has to pay for the energy costs of the data and storing that data. For it to be as valuable as possible, you want as much longitudinal data as possible, and that costs a lot of money, not even talking about protecting that data. So how do we make sure that there's a constant flow of funds to keep the system self-sufficient and running? Then there are a couple of different models within that. Again, happy to talk about it later. But nationally, we are doing a few things that also are helping to provide more certainty to the market. So we've published a life sciences industrial strategy and have published also a life sciences sector deal that shows the direction of the UK, both in our funding, our ambitions, and our ideas for the next 15 to 20 years. A huge undertaking, but something that I, as a scientist working for government, am extremely appreciative of. Another thing that we've published that I would encourage all of you to check out is the Department for Health and Social Care published a code of conduct for data-driven health and care technology. It has 10 different priority strands of work that need to happen and that the UK government is committed to undertaking to ensure a smooth transition of data-driven health and care technology. We've also put 300 million pounds towards the AI to Early Diagnostics Challenge. So having a dedicated pot of funding is really something we're excited about, because here at the NIH there's a very small pool of money that actually crosses over between looking at data and looking at healthcare. Then we also have NHSX, which is so there's National Health Services England, which is the traditional thing that you think of when you think of NHS. But NHSX is actually going to work on the interoperability between all of our nation states, and all of our states within our nation, excuse me, and then NHS Digital. So we have a department within the National Health Services that's also specifically looking at our digital platforms, from the e-health records to actually working on an interactive chart system that provides diagnostic support to the physicians and also can prompt different questions to the physician based on the presentation of the patient. But also, if you track that back 3 more steps to when the patient's filling out why they're in for their visit, it can also prompt different questions to save time. And all of that, when I say to save time, it's to increase the amount of time the physician actually has to speak with the patient, which is quite revolutionary. So all of that to be said, what is the challenge that I want to leave us with? And the thing that I always have to think about as a scientist first is, how can I talk to venture capitalists and government at the same time? Because that's usually the easiest place to start, because you think they're so completely different, and we're really not if you think about how to talk to us. Oh, there's where the pointer is. So the first thing is simplify the science. None of us are scientists. We probably have no idea what you're saying. I say that in a generalization because I have a science background, but more likely than not, no venture capitalist and no government employee actually has any idea what's going on in health and life sciences, and forget it if you're also combining it with deep learning. So think about the challenge and think about it in a realistic way, because we're dealing with deep learning in science or deep learning in healthcare. Could be challenging, but we also just got the first image of a black hole. So I think we can do it. The next thing is to be inspirational. Colloquially, I call it tell your Black Mirror story. Think about something that's relatable, something that can be told where your technology or where your innovation might be 3 to 5 years from now, so that the systems around us, as I mentioned earlier, they all have to merge and all have to shift, and we have to think about how we can actually leverage the opportunity in technology. So we also have to be thinking about our technologies and opportunities 3 to 5 years out. And the last thing is to focus on returns. And that's a little bit tough to say at times, but at the end of the day, money does talk. And when we're talking about healthcare and the health system, I always like to put it or reframe it in my mind as the challenge with type 1 diabetes. We can't think of it as what healthcare company is going to give up $1,000 a month for the remainder of someone's life when they're diagnosed at 15 with type 1 diabetes. That's a lot of money. So when you're selling your innovation, or when you're thinking about developing research or a research technology that could cure type 1 diabetes, rather than thinking about it as the cost of investment and how much it actually means to the patient, we also have to reframe it to what's the life cost of that disease, and how can the government make sure that we are appropriately compensated for what we're actually saving the economy in that sense. It's an unfortunate thing to have to think about someone's life from an economic perspective, but that's how the hospitals have to think. So when we really talk about our technologies, we still have to always focus on returns. Still, I would say the most important one is to simplify the science. So throughout the conference and the 2 days that we have here, as we're networking, as we're thinking, as we're talking together, I would just challenge all of us to think about these 3 things and how we can start to distill those questions and those problems down to make sure that we can network with all of those different people within the ecosystem who need to be able to contribute and start to adapt the different policies so that we can start to transition machine learning or deep learning healthcare from high risk, high uncertainty to low risk and low uncertainty. Thank you.